The silence in this house had become a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, settling into the dust motes dancing in the slivers of sunlight that dared to pierce the heavy velvet curtains. They said it was for my own good. Of course. Everything they did, every gentle restraint, every patronizing suggestion, every lock subtly changed on a cabinet I no longer needed access to, was layered with the sweet, suffocating perfume of concern. Concern for my frailty, for my delicate health, for the fact that at my age venturing beyond the familiar threshold was simply too risky. Risky for me, they'd murmur, their eyes not quite meeting mine, but oh so very convenient for them. My son Thomas, with his perpetually furrowed brow and the air of a man carrying the weight of the world, most of which I suspected was self-imposed, and his wife Clara, whose smile never quite reached her cool, assessing eyes, had appointed themselves the guardians of my declining years. Declining, a word they used often, a gentle nudge towards the inevitable, towards a smaller, quieter existence that suited their narrative of my life. They managed my finances, ostensibly to save me the bother, screened my calls, limited my visitors. Too much excitement isn't good for you, mother dear, and spoke of my future in hushed tones, as if I were already a ghost haunting the hallways of my own home. This house, the one I had built a life in, raised children in, nursed a marriage through thick and thin within these very walls, had become my gilded cage. They'd talk about the garden, a wild, untamed thing I used to love, and how it was just too much for me now, the steps too steep, the bending too strenuous. They'd bring me a single rose in a vase, plucked from the bushes I'd planted decades ago, a token from the world they said was too dangerous for me to inhabit freely anymore. Frail. The word felt like a shroud. I could see it in their eyes when they looked at me. Not the woman who had run a business, navigated grief, raised two headstrong children alone after their father left, but a faded photograph, brittle and easily torn. They saw only the lines etched by time, not the stories they told. The slight tremor in my hands, not the strength they still held. The occasional forgetfulness, not the lifetime of memories sharp as glass shards. They projected onto me their own fear of aging, perhaps, or perhaps, more cynically, they saw only an obstacle to be managed, a resource to be controlled. It was the quiet assumptions that cut the deepest. The way Thomas would finish my sentences, not because I was struggling, but because he'd already decided what I should say. The way Clara would steer conversations away from anything that might pique my interest in the outside world. A documentary about faraway lands, a news report about a new museum exhibit. Anything that hinted at movement, at life beyond these walls. They didn't forbid outright. Oh no, that would be too crude. Their control was far more insidious, a slow tightening of the leash disguised as loving care. Oh mother, you wouldn't want to catch a chill, not with your constitution, if I suggested a walk on a slightly breezy day. That sounds awfully tiring, dear. Why don't you just rest here? If I mentioned feeling restless. They curated my world until it was small enough to fit inside their busy lives and easily managed box they could check off their list of responsibilities. My friends, the few who still called, found their calls often diverted to an answering machine. Clara checked, messages relayed days later with a subtle spin. Mrs. Gable sounded a bit tired. I told her you were resting. Invitations to bridge games or tea were gently deflected. Mother isn't feeling up to it this week, perhaps another time. Eventually, the calls dwindled. Why bother, when every interaction had to be filtered through the watchful eyes of my benevolent captors? The irony was a bitter pill I swallowed daily. I had worked my entire life for independence, first escaping the suffocating expectations of my own upbringing, then building a life from scratch after the divorce, then navigating the choppy waters of single parenthood and running a small, demanding business. Strength had been my constant companion, necessity my stern teacher. And now, in the years I had imagined I would finally have the freedom to simply be, to read, to travel, to pursue the quiet hobbies I'd deferred, I was deemed incapable, unworthy of making my own choices. They spoke of nursing homes with a chilling casualness, as if it were the next logical step, a foregone conclusion because I was frail. Frail. The word echoed in the oppressive silence, a constant reminder of their judgment, their dismissal of the vibrant, resilient woman they refused to see. It was a slow, quiet war of attrition, wearing down my spirit, not with grand battles but with 1,000 tiny cuts disguised as kindness. But beneath the surface of the quiet, compliant mother they thought they had confined, something was stirring. Something sharp and hot and undeniably alive. They saw frailty. I saw an opportunity. The house itself became a character in my quiet rebellion. Every creaking floorboard, every draft sighing through the old windows, every shadow stretching across the hallway became part of a landscape I had to navigate with new eyes. Eyes that weren't simply seeing the familiar but observing, strategizing. They had taken away my car keys years ago, citing my reflexes and the dangers of the road. My walking routes were implicitly limited to the short, flat loop around the immediate block. Anything more ambitious met with worried frowns and dire warnings. Access to my bank accounts was now a supervised event, a joint account they had insisted upon for easier management. Every avenue of independent movement and financial autonomy had been systematically closed off, leaving me feeling like a bird with clipped wings, hopping uselessly in a spacious cage. But birds, even with clipped wings, still watch the sky. They still dream of flight. I spent hours in the sunroom, supposedly for the vitamin D that was so crucial for my brittle bones. But really, I was watching the mailman, studying his route, noticing the times. Thomas and Clara were typically out of the house, watching the cars pass by, noting the bus schedule at the end of the street, a service they assumed I would never use. I listened to their conversations, little snippets caught through open doors, Thomas complaining to Clara about the burden of managing my affairs, the hassle of doctor's appointments they scheduled without consulting me, the casual certainty in their voices that I was simply a problem to be managed until I wasn't anymore. Clara with her perfect, unfeeling logic, outlining the financial benefits of selling the house, eventually after I was settled somewhere more appropriate. They spoke as if I had already vacated my own body. My opinions, my desires, irrelevant. It was like listening to strangers discuss the fate of a piece of furniture they were tired of. The pain of this realization was a cold, sharp ache, far worse than any physical ailment they attributed to me. Betrayal, delivered with a smile and a pat on the hand, was a poison that seeped into your soul. I remembered a trip I had taken with my husband, decades ago, to Italy. The chaos, the beauty, the sheer vibrant life of it all. We talked about seeing Paris one day, Rome, maybe even venturing further afield. Life, as it does, intervened. Responsibilities mounted, money was tight, and the dreams were filed away for a someday that never seemed to arrive. Until now, when someday was staring me in the face, albeit through the bars of my own making, or rather theirs. I started small, very small. I began hoarding stamps. They sent out my bills and correspondence, assuming I had no need for such things. But the mailman occasionally dropped off junk mail with prepaid envelopes, or little promotional items that sometimes included a stamp. I'd tuck them away, hidden in a small embroidered pouch I kept in my sewing basket, a seemingly innocuous collection of threads and needles. Then I started observing the postbox at the end of the street more closely. How often was it emptied? At what time? Was it visible from the house? Could I reach it without being seen? These were the logistics of a great escape, planned not with blueprints and getaway cars, but with the quiet cunning born of desperation and a lifetime of being underestimated. My mind, which they thought was clouding with age, felt sharper than ever, focused with a clarity I hadn't possessed in years. Every interaction became a test, every conversation a performance. I played the part of the slightly confused, easily tired old woman they expected. I'd nod vaguely at their instructions, ask simple, non-threatening questions, and let them assume I was incapable of complex thought or planning. The more they believed in my frailty, the less watchful they were for true signs of defiance. They saw the act and believed it was reality. This was my silent weapon, the symbolic object that began to crystallize my resolve, wasn't grand or exotic. It was a simple, faded photograph. It sat on the mantelpiece, tucked behind a more recent, carefully posed family portrait, one where I looked particularly drawn and pale, a physical manifestation of their narrative. The photograph was of me, younger, perhaps in my late 20s, standing in front of a fountain, laughing, my hair slightly windblown. It wasn't a famous landmark, just a simple fountain in a park, but the joy on my face was unmistakable, uninhibited. It was a me I hadn't seen in a long time, a me they had never truly known. Looking at it, I felt a pang of sorrow, a mourning for that lost self. But then, a spark. That woman was still here, buried deep, but not extinguished. She remembered laughter. She remembered freedom. She remembered a world much larger than the confines of this house. They hadn't taken her away, only tried to wallpaper over her existence. The house itself, once a symbol of warmth and security, had become a monument to their control. Every room held memories. Yes, but now also the phantom weight of their disapproval, their dismissiveness. The sturdy oak table in the dining room where countless family meals had been shared now felt like a stage for their condescension. The comfortable armchair in the living room where I used to read for hours felt like a cage built for one. I started revisiting old things, not just the photograph, but books I hadn't opened in years, a dusty atlas I found on a high shelf, old letters tied with ribbon. I wasn't just reminiscing, I was researching, gathering intel. The atlas with its thin, brittle pages became a source of quiet fascination. I'd trace routes with my finger, calculate distances. Imagine the feeling of being in those faraway places. Paris, the city of light. It had always held a particular allure, perhaps fueled by old movies and romantic novels. It felt like the antithesis of my current existence, vibrant, cultured, alive. A place where a woman could simply be, anonymous in the crowd, free from the weight of expectation and judgment. The more I thought about it, the more it felt less like a dream and more like a destination. A destination that would serve as the ultimate rebuttal to their narrative of my frailty. The sheer audacity of it thrilled me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. It felt dangerous and exhilarating, a secret fire burning low in my belly. They assumed I spent my days doing crosswords and watching television. And yes, I did some of that, playing my part. But I also spent hours online, on the old laptop they had given me, thinking it was just for emails and harmless browsing. They didn't realize I was learning about train schedules, passport requirements. Mine was long expired, another detail they had conveniently overlooked. Renewing, currency exchange, booking accommodations. I did it slowly, meticulously, clearing my browsing history like a digital phantom, leaving no trace. Every search was a small act of rebellion. Every piece of information gained was a chip at the wall they had built around me. I discovered that applying for a new passport wasn't as complicated as they probably assumed it would be. It required documentation I knew I had stored away in a box in the attic, a box they had deemed too heavy for me to access. They thought the attic was off limits, a place for forgotten things. But I remembered every inch of this house, every hiding place, every shortcut. The resentment which had simmered for years was now a cold, clear fuel for my determination. They had taken so much, my autonomy, my dignity, my connections. But they couldn't take my mind. Not entirely. And they couldn't take my history. The woman I had been, the woman I still was, beneath the layers of their control. The photograph on the mantelpiece wasn't just a reminder of the past. It was a promise of the future. A future I would seize, one carefully planned step at a time. The turning point, the moment the quiet resentment solidified into concrete action, wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but something far more mundane, and perhaps because of that, far more revealing of the depth of their condescension. Thomas and Clara were discussing my will. They didn't know I could hear them, their voices carrying clearly through the slightly ajar study door. Clara was outlining the practicalities, the sensible distribution of assets. My assets, the house, my savings, the few pieces of jewelry I owned. They spoke of it as if it were already theirs to decide, my life a chapter neatly concluded, awaiting only the final period. Clara mentioned a specific sum of money, a significant amount I had saved over decades, money I had intended to use for something special, perhaps that travel I had always dreamed of, or a legacy for a cause I cared about. Clara referred to it as excess funds, that would complicate matters if not dealt with appropriately now. Thomas agreed, his voice heavy with the false burden of responsibility. It's for the best. Mother wouldn't know what to do with all that anyway. She's not exactly active anymore. Active. The word hung in the air, sharp and dismissive. Not active, as if my mind, my feelings, my desires, had simply ceased to exist because I wasn't physically running marathons or attending lively social gatherings. They saw stillness and equated it with absence of life. This wasn't just about money. It was about their complete and utter erasure of my personhood. That money represented years of hard work, of sacrifices, of careful planning for a future they were now casually dismantling. It was the last tangible piece of my independence they hadn't fully wrestled away, and they were already dividing the spoils. Lying in my bed that night, the darkness amplifying the injustice of their words, the casual cruelty of their assumptions, something inside me shifted irrevocably. The fear that had sometimes held me back, the worry about the unknown, the sheer effort involved in breaking free began to recede, replaced by a cold, fierce resolve. They thought I wouldn't know what to do with my own money. They thought I wasn't active enough to decide my own fate. I would show them exactly how active I could be. The planning intensified. I needed access to that box in the attic. They had placed a heavy trunk in front of the attic door, ostensibly to store winter blankets, but I knew its real purpose. It was a barrier. Getting it out of the way required more physical effort than they believed I was capable of. But they weren't there to see the quiet determination that fueled my muscles, the slow, steady pushing and pulling when they were out running errands. It took several attempts, spread over days, feigning tiredness and needing to rest in between, making sure to restore everything to its original position. It was exhausting. Yes, but each small movement felt like a victory. Finding the box required rummaging through dust-covered memories, old photo albums, forgotten keepsakes, and there, at the bottom, were the documents. My old passport, long expired, but containing the crucial information. My birth certificate, my marriage certificate, a bittersweet find, financial statements from before they took over. I gathered what I needed, my hands trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the significance of these papers. They were the keys to my past, and now, the keys to my future. I carefully replaced everything else, rearranged the trunk, leaving no sign of my intrusion. My secret life was taking shape, unfolding in the quiet moments when they believed I was simply resting. The internet research became bolder: how to apply for a passport quickly, where to get passport photos taken without needing to travel far, how to book travel discreetly. I learned about online travel agencies, about getting documents delivered to a separate address, perhaps a kind neighbor I could trust. Mrs. Gable, the neighbor Clara thought, sounded tired. She was a widow, independent, with a mischievous glint in her eye whenever we managed a brief, unsupervised chat over the fence line before Clara invariably appeared. She had always seemed to see me, the real me, beneath the layers of their control. A risk perhaps, but a necessary one. The tension in the house was a palpable thing, though only I seemed to feel it. Every time Thomas or Clara entered the room, I would quickly minimize screens, adopt a relaxed posture, feign interest in the television. My heart would race, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, but outwardly, I was calm, the picture of docile frailty. They were so confident in their control, so blind to the quiet storm brewing right under their noses. And that confidence was their greatest vulnerability. The day I decided to ask Mrs. Gable for help felt like stepping onto a tightrope. It was a Tuesday, their usual grocery shopping day, giving me a precious window of opportunity. I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that made me look less frail than my usual house clothes. A small act of defiance in itself. I practiced my approach, the words I would use, the tone I would adopt. It had to be casual, not desperate, hinting at a small personal project rather than a grand escape. I walked to the edge of the garden, pretending to admire the wilting roses, waiting until I saw Mrs. Gable puttering in her own garden next door. Our eyes met across the fence. She offered a gentle smile, the kind that acknowledged time and shared experience without needing many words. "Lovely day, Agnes," she called out using my first name, a small courtesy my own family had largely abandoned in favor of mother. "It is, Martha," I replied, my voice feeling rusty from disuse. I took a deep breath. "Martha, I was wondering, I've been trying to sort through some old papers and I need to send off for a replacement document. The application needs to go to an address other than this one, just for privacy reasons. You understand? Would you possibly be willing to let me have it sent here to your address? It's nothing complicated, just a government form." I held my breath. I hadn't mentioned a passport specifically, framing it vaguely. Mrs. Gable paused, her eyes assessing mine for a moment. I saw understanding dawn, a flicker of knowing in her kind face. She didn't ask questions about why or what document. She simply nodded. "Of course, Agnes. Happy to help. Just let me know when you're expecting it." Relief washed over me, so potent it made me momentarily lightheaded. "Oh, thank you, Martha. That means a great deal." It meant everything. This small act of trust, of quiet solidarity, was a lifeline. The wheels were now turning outside the confines of my cage. Getting the passport photos taken required another carefully planned excursion. I had found a small photography studio a few blocks away, one that didn't require an appointment. On another grocery day, armed with a carefully crafted excuse about needing a specific type of yarn only available at the craft store across town, a store Clara knew I liked, but deemed too far for me to get to, I managed to convince Thomas to drop me off, promising to call when I was ready to be picked up. He was reluctant, muttering about the hassle and my poor stamina, but the idea of a couple of hours of peace at home swayed him. I didn't go to the craft store first. I walked directly, as quickly as my legs would carry me, to the photography studio. My heart hammered in my chest, every passing car a potential threat, every pedestrian a possible witness. The studio was small, cluttered, and blessedly empty. The young woman behind the counter didn't bat an eye. She took my photos efficiently, printed them quickly. I paid in cash money I had, slowly accumulated from my small allowance by foregoing little comforts. Another secret act of saving. Clutching the photos, feeling a surge of triumph, I then walked to the craft store, bought a single skein of yarn, and called Thomas, feigning exhaustion. "Oh, Thomas, I'm so tired. This yarn was heavier than I expected," he grumbled, but came to get me. I collapsed into the car, playing the part of the weary invalid, the passport photos hidden deep in my handbag, a precious secret. Sending the passport application was another hurdle. I couldn't risk mailing it from the house. I waited for another opportune moment. A quick solo trip to the local pharmacy for a prescription, a trip they monitored closely, but allowed as it was deemed essential. I had the sealed envelope hidden in my sleeve. Walking back, I detoured slightly, heart pounding, and slipped it into the postbox at the end of Mrs. Gable's street, the one I had been watching for weeks. The click of the mailbox lid closing felt like a tiny explosion, a declaration of independence heard only by me. The wait for the passport felt interminable. Every knock on Mrs. Gable's door sent a jolt of anxiety through me, wondering if it was the delivery, wondering if she was home, wondering if she would be able to intercept it before Thomas or Clara somehow found out. I had explained to her that it was a private matter I didn't want my family involved in, and she, bless her, had simply nodded, her eyes full of a silent understanding that spoke volumes. Finally, one afternoon a week later, she appeared at my back door, a large manila envelope in her hand, her expression neutral. "This came for you, Agnes." She handed it to me discreetly, her fingers brushing mine, "Thank you, Martha," I whispered, a lump in my throat. I knew what it was. Back in my room, door locked, I opened it with shaking hands. My new passport. My face stared back at me from the photo. Older now? Yes, but with an undeniable spark in my eyes. The woman from the old photograph, rekindled. It was real. The dream was becoming tangible. They thought I was sorting through old papers, perhaps organizing recipes or writing tedious letters. They had no idea I was holding my ticket to freedom, the key that would unlock the gilded cage they had built around me. The travel arrangements were the final, most complex piece of the puzzle. Booking flights and accommodation required more internet access, more careful clearing of history, more secrecy. I used a prepaid debit card I had purchased with the cash I'd saved, loading just enough for the immediate expenses. Paris. It still felt audacious, almost impossibly grand for the woman they deemed too frail to walk around the block unsupervised. But the scale of the destination was part of the point. It wasn't just about traveling. It was about traveling somewhere that would shatter their perception of me completely, somewhere utterly removed from the quiet, contained life they had planned. I booked a small, modest hotel in a relatively quiet neighborhood, not far from a metro station. I chose dates several weeks in the future, allowing time for any unexpected hitches and, crucially, coinciding with a planned weekend trip. Thomas and Clara were taking out of state for a wedding. Their absence was the window I needed. It provided the perfect cover, the longest period I would be unsupervised and unquestioned. I wouldn't need a grand escape. I could simply leave as if I were stepping out for a walk. Only I wouldn't be coming back to this house for a very long time. The planning felt surreal. One moment I was discussing my diet and medication with Clara. The next I was looking at maps of the Paris metro, figuring out how to get from Charles de Gaulle Airport to my hotel. The contrast was stark, almost comical. Their narrow world versus the wide-open possibilities I was secretly embracing. Packing was a challenge. How to gather what I needed. Clothes, toiletries, essentials, without arousing suspicion. I couldn't just pack a suitcase. I began setting aside items slowly, small things tucked away in a duffel bag, hidden in the back of my closet. A change of clothes here, a pair of comfortable shoes there, a small toiletry kit. I made sure to leave behind the things they would expect me to have. My usual pajamas, the book I was supposedly reading by my bedside. I needed to disappear without initially seeming to have disappeared, merely to be temporarily absent. The tension in the days leading up to their trip was almost unbearable. Every glance from Thomas or Clara felt like an interrogation. Every question about my plans for the weekend felt loaded with unspoken suspicion. I maintained my persona, the slightly vague, grateful for their care mother. "Oh, I'll be just fine, dear. A quiet weekend at home will be lovely. Perhaps I'll finally finish that knitting project," Liz told with a smile and a gentle nod. The irony tasted like victory. The day of their departure arrived. They fussed over me, listing instructions, reminding me how to use the emergency contact system they had installed, reiterating the phone numbers I should call if I needed anything. They left me with prepared meals in the fridge, a patronizing abundance of caution. "Now, Mother, you have everything you need, don't you? Are you sure you feel up to being on your own for a few days?" Clara asked, her tone dripping with a performative concern that grated on my nerves. "I'll be perfectly fine, Clara. Thank you for your thoughtfulness," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside me. Thomas gave me a perfunctory hug. "All right, Mom, we'll call you tonight. Have a wonderful time," I said, watching them load their luggage into the car. As they pulled away, their car disappearing down the street, a profound silence descended on the house, different from the oppressive silence of my confinement. This silence was liberating. It was the sound of possibility. I walked to the window and watched until the car was completely out of sight. Then, and only then, did the facade drop. My heart was pounding, a frantic rhythm of fear and exhilaration. The time had come. The frail, incapable woman they thought they had left behind was about to walk out the door and reclaim her life. The moments after they left were a blur of focused activity fueled by pure adrenaline. There was no time for hesitation, no room for doubt. The carefully packed duffel bag was lighter than I expected, containing only the essential. I put on a sensible coat, grabbed my handbag containing my passport, plane ticket confirmation, prepaid card, and a small amount of emergency cash I had also squirreled away, and walked to the back door. The back door was less visible from the street and from the neighbors' houses, offering a slightly more discreet exit. I paused for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, looking back at the house. It stood there, solid and silent, a witness to years of my life, both good and bad. It had been my sanctuary, then my prison. Leaving it felt strange, a mix of liberation and a faint lingering sadness for the life that had been lived within its walls and the life that had been stolen from me here. But the pull of the future, of freedom, was stronger than the anchor of the past. I opened the door and stepped out, closing it quietly behind me. I didn't lock it. Let them wonder. The air outside felt different, sharper, cooler. I walked down the garden path, not towards the street this time, but towards the small gate at the back that led to a less used alleyway. It was a route I hadn't taken in years, one they likely assumed I couldn't manage anymore. The gate creaked slightly as I opened it, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet afternoon. I slipped through, closing it behind me, and found myself in the narrow alleyway, lined with overgrown hedges and forgotten bins. It smelled of damp earth and dust. This was the path less taken, the one that led away from their watchful eyes. I walked briskly, my pace surprising even myself. The fear was still there, a knot in my stomach, but it was intertwined with a growing sense of power, of reclaiming my own agency. I reached the end of the alley, emerging onto a quiet side street, several blocks away from my house. From there it was a short walk to the bus stop at the end of the street, the one I had observed so many times from my sunroom window. Waiting for the bus felt like an eternity. Every passing car seemed to slow. Every pedestrian seemed to look at me. I kept my face forward, trying to appear as unremarkable as possible. Just an elderly woman waiting for a bus. The bus arrived, a lumbering metal beast that represented my first real step towards freedom. I climbed the steps, paid my fare with shaking fingers, and found a seat near the back. As the bus pulled away, taking me further and further from the life I was leaving behind, I allowed myself a small private smile. They thought I was resting at home, perhaps knitting or watching television. They had no idea I was on my way to the airport, on my way to Paris. The journey to the airport was long, involving a transfer, each step a mini victory against the limitations they had imposed. I navigated the public transport system I hadn't used in years, remembering routes, figuring out connections. My mind, far from being frail, was sharp and focused. At the airport, the sheer scale of the terminal was daunting, a bustling microcosm of the world they said I was too fragile to engage with, but I wasn't overwhelmed. I felt a quiet determination settle over me. I checked in, went through security, my heart rate elevated, but my resolve firm, waiting at the departure gate, surrounded by strangers heading to destinations all over the world. I felt a profound sense of anonymity and possibility. No one here knew my history, my struggles, the cage I had escaped. I was just another passenger, a woman embarking on a journey. Looking out the window at the planes taking off and landing, I thought of Thomas and Clara likely settled into their wedding weekend, perhaps sending me a perfunctory text to check in. They would assume my silence was the quiet of my usual routine. They would have no idea that their frail mother was about to fly across an ocean, towards a city they had deemed utterly beyond my reach. The plane took off, climbing into the sky, carrying me away from the life of quiet confinement. Looking down at the receding landscape, I didn't feel triumphant, not yet. I felt a deep, abiding sense of relief, a shedding of a heavy skin. The woman they knew, the one confined by their assumptions and control, was no longer on the ground. She was in the air, soaring towards a future she had seized for herself, piece by painstaking piece. Landing in Paris was an assault on the senses, a vibrant, chaotic symphony after the muted tones of my recent life. The language, The smells of coffee and pastries, the constant murmur of voices, the sheer energy of the city. It was overwhelming, exhilarating. I felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated joy, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. I had done it. I was here. Navigating the airport, finding the train to the city center, locating my small hotel. It all required focus and effort, but it was the effort of living, not just existing. The hotel was simple but clean and welcoming. The woman at the front desk, a cheerful young thing with bright eyes, didn't see a frail old woman. She saw a guest, a customer, a person. It was a small thing, but it felt immense. My room was small with a view of a narrow street and a glimpse of a mansard roof. It wasn't grand, but it was mine, temporary though it was, and it was miles away from the house that had felt like my tomb. That first evening, I walked, just walked. No destination, no schedule, no permission needed. I walked along the Seine as dusk settled, the lights of the city beginning to twinkle, the Eiffel Tower piercing the twilight sky. It was even more beautiful than the pictures, more alive. Tears pricked my eyes, not from sadness, but from a profound sense of freedom, of gratitude, and of bittersweet reflection. I thought of all the years I had waited, all the dreams deferred, all the control I had allowed others to exert, and I thought of the quiet strength I had found within myself, the resilience I hadn't known I still possessed. They thought me frail. Here, walking the streets of Paris, I felt stronger than I had in decades. The next day was for exploring. I visited a small museum, sat in a park, and watched the world go by. Ate a croissant from a local bakery that tasted like pure heaven. Every simple act was imbued with significance, because it was an act of my own choosing, performed in a place I had reached through my own efforts. I wasn't performing frailty. I was embodying independence. The idea of the postcard came to me while I was sitting at a small cafe, sipping coffee, watching people pass. It wasn't enough to simply be here. I needed them to know. Not out of malice, but out of a necessity to reset the narrative, to show them the truth they had deliberately ignored. A phone call would be too easy for them to dismiss, too easy to control the conversation. A postcard, something tangible, unexpected, delivered into their carefully controlled world. It would be a silent, undeniable statement. I found a small stationery shop and chose a postcard with a classic image of the Eiffel Tower, iconic and unmistakable. What message to write? It needed to be brief, impactful, undeniable, something that confirmed my location without revealing too much, something that spoke volumes in its simplicity. I sat back at the cafe, the blank postcard in front of me, and let the words form in my mind. They thought I was too frail to travel, especially not to Paris. The contrast was the power. The undeniable proof of my presence here would be the ultimate refutation of their assumptions. I wrote the date, the city, and a short, simple message, something that acknowledged their perceived reality and presented my new one, something that couldn't be argued with, only reacted to. The power wasn't in explaining myself, or in seeking their approval. It was in the quiet, irrefutable fact of my being here, in Paris. A place they had decided was impossible for me. I bought a stamp, found a post box, and dropped the postcard in. It felt like dropping a small bomb into their carefully constructed world. The act was final, irreversible. The quiet rebellion I had plotted in secret was now a public declaration. The days in Paris that followed were steeped in this new reality. I wasn't just a tourist. I was an escapee, a renegade, a woman rediscovering the world and herself within it. I visited Notre Dame from the outside, given the recent fire but still majestic, wandered through the Latin Quarter, took a boat trip on the Seine. Each experience was savored, acutely aware of the freedom that allowed it. I wasn't running away, I was running towards something, towards life, lived on my own terms. The knowledge that the postcard was making its way across the Atlantic added a layer of tension to my days. I imagined its arrival, the surprise, the disbelief, the scramble for answers. They would try to contact me. I knew The quiet silence they had imposed on me would be shattered by their urgent attempts to regain control. But for now, I was free to walk, to explore, to simply breathe the air of a city that knew nothing of my past. A city that simply accepted me as I was. Another face in the crowd, another soul seeking beauty and experience. They thought I was too frail to travel. But here I was, in Paris, living a life they couldn't control, and about to send them a reminder they would never forget. The day the postcard arrived, I wasn't there to witness the immediate fallout, but I could picture it with vivid clarity. Their return from the wedding trip, perhaps late Sunday evening, tired and ready to resume their quiet control over my supposedly uneventful life. Finding the mail piled up, Clara sorting through it with her usual efficiency. The mundane bills, the junk mail, the catalogs, and then nestled amongst them, a brightly colored postcard. An image of the Eiffel Tower, unmistakable, undeniably from Paris. Their eyes would scan the front, noting the French stamp, the Paris postmark, then they would flip it over. My handwriting, perhaps a little shaky, but legible, the date, the city. My brief message. I imagined the stunned silence that would fall over them. Disbelief, quickly followed by confusion, then anger. How? How could she have possibly gotten to Paris? Where did she get the money? The passport? How did she leave without them knowing? The questions would tumble out, accusatory and bewildered. Their carefully constructed narrative of my frailty, my incapacity, would crumble before their eyes. Revealed as the convenient fiction it was, they would try to call the house, of course. No answer. Panic would set in. They would check my room, expecting to find me there, perhaps ill, perhaps fallen. Finding it empty, my belongings, largely in place, would only deepen the mystery and their alarm. The duffel bag gone, perhaps a small detail they might miss initially in their haste. They would call the local hospitals, the police, a missing person report for the frail, elderly woman who couldn't possibly be anywhere but her home. The irony would be delicious if it weren't so steeped in the years of their control. I imagined Mrs. Gable next door, perhaps observing the commotion, the police cars, the frantic energy emanating from the house that was usually so quiet. Would she connect it to the envelope she had received from me? Would she know, with a quiet smile, that I had finally broken free? I didn't know for sure, but I hoped she did. I stayed in Paris, deliberately delaying contact, letting the news of my disappearance and subsequent reappearance via postcard filter through their world. It was an act of power, of taking control of the narrative they had dominated for so long. I knew they would eventually try to contact me in Paris, if they were resourceful enough to track down the source of the postcard or make inquiries about flights under my name. When the call came, it was Thomas, his voice tight with a mixture of relief and barely concealed fury. "Mother, is that you? Where in God's name are you? Are you in Paris?" His tone was demanding, not concerned. The facade was cracking. "Yes, Thomas, I'm in Paris," I replied, my voice calm, steady. Hearing my voice must have been a shock, confirmation that I wasn't a figment of their imagination or a casualty of my supposed frailty. "Paris? But how? Why? We've been worried sick. The police are involved." His voice was rising, betraying his loss of control. "I'm perfectly safe, Thomas, and I'm certainly not frail," I said, letting the word hang in the air, a quiet accusation. "I decided to take a trip. Something I've wanted to do for a long time." "A trip? Mother, you can't just disappear like that." We thought something terrible had happened. "And Paris? Alone? It's simply not safe for you." The familiar refrain of safety and frailty was still there, but now it sounded hollow, desperate. "I managed to get here just fine, Thomas. I arranged everything myself," I stated simply, letting the weight of that sink in. "The house? But everything here, Joe. What about your appointments? Your medication?" His concerns were logistical, practical. focused on the disruption to their lives, not on my well-being. The house will be fine. I've arranged for someone to look after it. I lied smoothly, improvising, the lie feeling surprisingly easy. And my appointments and medication are my concern, not yours. The silence on his end was telling. He was struggling to regain control, to fit me back into the box he had built. You need to come home, Mother. This is ridiculous. We'll book you a flight. Clara is beside herself. Clara? Of course, the master manipulator. I'm not coming home, Thomas. Not yet. I'm quite enjoying Paris. And other places, perhaps. The suggestion of further travel clearly rattled him. Other places? Mother, be reasonable. This is impulsive. Dangerous. You're not well enough for this kind of thing. That, Thomas, I said, my voice hardening slightly, is something you and Clara seem to believe, but it is not the truth. I am perfectly well, and I am no longer willing to live a life dictated by your convenience and your assumptions about my capabilities. It was a clean break, a line drawn. The conversation devolved into frustrated arguments on his end. My quiet refusal to engage in the old dynamic. I didn't need to justify myself or seek their permission, or even their understanding. My presence in Paris, confirmed by the postcard and now this call, was the only statement necessary. The betrayal had been deep, the years of confinement and dismissal heavy, but the freedom, the empowerment I felt in this moment, was a powerful antidote. They had underestimated me, reduced me to a caricature of frailty. But the woman who had survived and thrived, who had quietly planned her escape and executed it with precision, was far from frail. She was resilient, resourceful, and finally, gloriously free. The days and weeks that followed the arrival of the postcard and Thomas's frantic call were a dance between my newfound freedom and their increasingly desperate attempts to reassert control. They tried calls, emails, even sending a legal letter threatening to seek guardianship based on my erratic behavior and potential endangerment of self. The legal letter was Clara's touch, no doubt, cold and calculating. But I was prepared. That early research hadn't just been about travel. It had been about my rights, about the legal hurdles they would face if they tried this. I found a lawyer in Paris, an expatriate who specialized in international family law, recommended by a new acquaintance I had made, a fellow solo traveler who saw not my age but my spirit. Meeting with the lawyer felt like adding another layer of armor. She confirmed my rights, outlined my options, and drafted a firm, polite response to their legal threats, stating that I was of sound mind, traveling of my own volition, and considered their actions harassment. The response was sent not from the house they still thought of as mine to control, but from a law office in Paris, another postcard in its own way. Their attempts to reach me directly became more sporadic, laced with emotional pleas that rang hollow. Thomas spoke of his hurt and disappointment, Clara of the unnecessary worry I had caused. They never once apologized for their own actions, for the years of quiet control and dismissal. They were still operating within their framework of being the injured parties, the concerned children whose elderly mother had inexplicably gone rogue. I didn't respond to most of their messages. I was done explaining, done trying to make them see. My life was no longer a performance for their benefit. Paris became more than just a destination. It became a state of being. I settled into a rhythm, exploring different neighborhoods, practicing my rusty French, spending hours in museums and libraries. I met other people, people who saw me as an individual, not a role, people who were interested in my thoughts, my experiences, not just my perceived needs and limitations. I wasn't defined by my age or my past. I was defined by my present, by my choices. I rented a small apartment, deciding that my stay in Paris would be longer than just a defiant vacation. It felt like a more permanent declaration of independence. Selling the house back home became the next logical step. It was the last major tie to the life they had tried to confine me to, the most significant asset they had been circling like vultures. It would also provide me with the financial independence I needed to live comfortably without relying on the allowance they had so generously doled out. I contacted a real estate agent back home, not the one Thomas and Clara would have used, but someone independent, I instructed the agent to communicate with me only via email and to handle all interactions with my family through my lawyer. Selling the house was a process fraught with emotion. It held so many memories, the echoes of a different life. But standing in my small Parisian apartment, looking out at the unfamiliar rooftops, I knew it was the right decision. The house had become too heavy with the weight of their control, too tainted by the feeling of being trapped. It was no longer a home, but a monument to a chapter of my life that was now closed. The sale of the house was met with predictable outrage from Thomas and Clara. They tried to block it legally, citing my incompetence and claiming the sale was fraudulent. But my lawyer was prepared. The legal battle was unpleasant, dragging on for months, filled with depositions and documents that dissected my life. They presented me as fragile, confused, easily manipulated. Their lawyers painted a picture of an elderly woman who had lost her grasp on reality, taken advantage of by unknown parties, myself in their twisted logic. But I provided evidence of my sound mind, my careful planning, my clear intentions. I refused to attend any proceedings in person, providing testimony via video conference from Paris. Seeing their faces on the screen contorted with anger and frustration, while I sat calmly in my Parisian apartment, felt like the ultimate inversion of the power dynamic. They were the ones flailing, losing control, while I was grounded, composed, undeniably in charge of my own destiny. The court ultimately ruled in my favor. The evidence of my deliberate actions, my clear communication, and the lack of any actual proof of incompetence was overwhelming. The house was sold. The proceeds were deposited into an account I controlled completely, an account they had no access to. It was a resounding victory, not just legally, but emotionally. It validated my choices, my capabilities, the woman I knew myself to be. The quiet strength they had overlooked, the resilience they had dismissed as frailty, had finally been revealed, not through shouting or confrontation, but through deliberate action and undeniable results. I had taken their narrative and shredded it, replacing it with my own. The redemptive part of the journey wasn't about revenge, not truly. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, my right to exist on my own terms. Paris was the catalyst, the symbol, the place where I had dared to break free. But the real transformation had happened within me, in the quiet hours of planning, in the moments of fear overcome by resolve, in the simple act of stepping out the door. My relationship with Thomas and Clara, such as it was, remained strained, distant. They couldn't reconcile the image of the frail mother with the reality of the woman who had orchestrated her own escape and won a legal battle against them. There were occasional attempts at contact, tentative steps towards reconciliation, but they were always conditional, always hinting at a return to the old dynamic, a desire to put me back in the box, albeit a slightly larger one. I didn't close the door completely, but I kept it firmly ajar, on my terms. True reconciliation would require them to see me, truly see me, and accept the woman I was, not the woman they wanted or needed me to be. And I wasn't sure they were capable of that. But my happiness no longer depended on their approval or their understanding. I had built a new life, one filled with quiet purpose and unexpected joys. I continued to travel, though perhaps not as extensively as I once dreamed. I explored France, then ventured to other parts of Europe. Each journey was a testament to my continued independence, a silent, ongoing postcard sent to the universe. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done since my youth, finding joy in the vibrant colors and the freedom of expression. I volunteered at a local library, sharing my love of books with others. My days were full, not with the busy work of managing my frailty, but with the richness of living. They thought I was too frail to travel. They saw my age, my gray hair, the lines on my face, and they projected their own limitations onto me. They mistook quiet resilience for weakness, patience for passivity. They built a cage of concern and expected me to live out my days within its bars. But they didn't see the fire still burning within me, the unwavering spirit that refused to be extinguished. They didn't see the planner, The strategist, the woman who had navigated far greater challenges than they could ever comprehend. They thought they had the final say in my story, that my last chapter would be one of quiet decline. But they were wrong. My story was far from over. It was a story of betrayal, yes, and of loss. But ultimately, it was a story of resilience, of reclaiming power, and of finding freedom and redemption in the most unexpected of places. And it all started with a single postcard from Paris, a defiant splash of color in the muted landscape of their assumptions, a simple, powerful statement that shattered their world and allowed me to finally step back into my own. The quiet, undervalued woman they thought they knew was gone, replaced by the woman I had always been, finally free to live, to breathe, to travel, unbound by their expectations and their fear. Frail? Not me. I was just getting started.